What would you do if the person who treated you with the most disdain suddenly needed your help? Would you hesitate, or would you act despite the years of prejudice they'd shown you? For a 10-year-old black boy, the answer was simple. He would save their life. This was the choice he made when, in the middle of a stormy night, he found himself rushing to pull a racist banker from a burning car, a man who moments earlier had dismissed him as nothing more than an invisible inconvenience. It was a typical rainy night, with the streets slick and dangerous, the kind of weather that made driving nearly impossible. The wind whipped through the city, and the sound of raindrops hitting the pavement echoed in the silence of the night. A luxury car sped through the flooded street, its tires skimming the wet surface as it barreled forward. Inside, the driver, a middle-aged man dressed in expensive clothing, oblivious to the world around him, was engrossed in a phone conversation. The man was a successful banker, his wealth and power obvious in the way he carried himself. Yet, despite all his success, he carried a deep-seated arrogance and racial prejudice that he imposed on those he considered beneath him. The 10-year-old boy, meanwhile, walked along the sidewalk, his backpack heavy with the day's lessons. He was used to the rain, used to the long walk home, and he kept his head down, focused on getting home. His life wasn't easy. He had faced discrimination both in school and in the community, often feeling invisible to those around him. But that night, he would be anything but invisible. He was crossing the street when the car came into view. His heart raced as he saw the car careen out of control, the tires screeching as they slid on the wet asphalt. Without hesitation, the boy sprinted toward the car, risking his own safety in an instant. He barely thought about the danger, knowing that if he didn't act, the car would slam into the guardrail just ahead, possibly injuring or even killing the driver. He didn't stop to think about the man behind the wheel, the banker who had sneered at him, who had called him worthless, and who had treated him as less than human. The boy rushed forward, using all his strength to yank open the door of the car. With a burst of adrenaline, the boy pulled the banker out of the vehicle, barely avoiding the wreckage. The car crashed into the guardrail moments later, exploding in a ball of fire that lit up the night sky. The heat from the blast singed the air, and the boy's heart pounded in his chest as he managed to drag the stunned banker away from the wreck. The banker coughed, still in disbelief, his mind racing to understand what had just happened. The boy, drenched in rain, stood over him, barely able to catch his breath. The fire had burned bright, but the boy's courage had burned even brighter. As the emergency vehicles arrived and the crowd began to gather, the boy stood still, watching the banker slowly regain his senses. The man, still shaken by the near-death experience, finally realized the magnitude of what had just occurred. The boy had saved him. The same boy who had been nothing more than an object of disdain just moments before had risked his life to save him. And yet, the banker's first reaction wasn't gratitude. It was discomfort. He looked up at the boy with cold eyes, unsure how to react. For the boy, the act of saving the banker was just that, a moment of bravery. But for the banker, it was a moment of reckoning. His life had been saved by the very person he had disrespected, and it forced him to confront his own biases in a way that nothing else could. The boy, knowing this, walked away quietly. He didn't expect gratitude. He didn't need it. He had acted because it was the right thing to do. The story quickly spread, and as the boy's bravery was praised, the banker's arrogance started to crumble. He couldn't ignore the fact that the person who had just saved him had been treated unfairly for so long, simply because of the color of his skin. The boy's courage became a symbol not only of heroism, but of the power of kindness and the possibility of change. It wasn't just about saving a life. It was about changing hearts and minds, breaking down the walls of prejudice that had long divided them. As the community rallied around the boy, offering their praise and admiration, the banker found himself at a crossroads. The kindness he had been shown by the boy, the very person he had looked down upon, forced him to reconsider everything he thought he knew about race and respect. The boy had changed his life in a way no amount of wealth or status could have. The banker had been saved, yes, but more than that, he had been forced to reckon with his own biases. For the boy, this moment was just the beginning. What had started as a simple act of saving a life had turned into a life-altering experience, not just for him, but for everyone involved. In a world where racial prejudice often goes unchecked, the boy had shown the power of courage, compassion, and humanity. And in doing so, he had changed the course of his life, and the banker's, forever. The black boy grew up in a modest home, where dreams seemed like distant stars. But his parents worked tirelessly to make sure those dreams could one day be within reach. With his father laboring long hours, and his mother sacrificing her own needs to care for the family, the boy learned early that success wasn't handed to anyone. It had to be earned through grit and determination. Though their home was small and their resources limited, the boy always knew the importance of hard work. He never let the weight of his circumstances crush his ambition. His dreams were big. He imagined himself becoming a doctor, a community leader, someone who could help change the world. But for now, those dreams were all he had, and he would cling to them with everything he had. In his neighborhood, though, life wasn't easy. People made assumptions about where he lived and what that meant for his potential. His neighborhood was considered dangerous by outsiders, a label that stuck regardless of the reality. The boy, despite the stereotypes that plagued him, remained focused. Every day was a new challenge, whether it was the taunts from classmates at school or the dismissive looks from strangers as he walked home. His peers didn't understand him, and many adults didn't either. Yet, despite this, he would always stand tall. He believed that no matter what people said about him or his neighborhood, he had the right to dream, to rise above the expectations that others placed on him. What made the boy stand out, however, wasn't just his resilience, it was his kindness. He had a generous spirit that shone through even in the darkest of times. Whether it was helping a neighbor carry groceries or tutoring a classmate in math, he gave without expecting anything in return. In a world that was quick to judge, the boy offered his help to anyone who needed it, regardless of who they were or how they treated him. He believed that acts of kindness were what made the world better, and that idea drove him every day. On the other hand, the banker, a man in his early 40s, lived in a completely different world. His life was defined by wealth and arrogance. Raised with privilege, he had climbed the corporate ladder with ease, and his success only reinforced his belief that he was better than others. He had little patience for people who he considered beneath him, especially those from different backgrounds or lower economic statuses. He wasn't subtle about it. His racist remarks were often aimed at anyone he deemed inferior, and the boy, from the very first day they crossed paths, became one of his targets. To the banker, the boy's neighborhood was a place to be avoided at all costs. He viewed it as a bad area, filled with crime and undeserving people. He'd often mutter derogatory comments about the people who lived there, seeing them as lazy, dangerous, or simply unworthy of attention. He had no interest in understanding their struggles or hearing their stories. To him, the boy was just another example of the failures he associated with that part of town. The banker's life was marked by his dismissive attitude toward anyone who didn't fit into his narrow view of what success looked like. The boy, despite his potential, was seen as no more than a nuisance to the banker, a young boy from a background that the banker believed would never lead to anything. Over the years, the banker had passed on countless opportunities to help those in need. But those who were like him, those who had wealth and power, were the ones he chose to help, ignoring the reality of those whose struggles were invisible to him. The boy and the banker existed in completely separate worlds, their lives marked by stark contrasts. The boy worked hard to rise above his circumstances, despite the prejudice he faced. The banker, meanwhile, continued to live in a bubble of privilege, where everything came easily, and the struggles of those unlike him were invisible. But that night, when their worlds collided, everything changed. The boy's courage, in a split-second decision, would turn the tide for both of them. It was a moment that neither could have anticipated, and it would have consequences no one could predict. The boy watched as the luxury car sped down the slick road, the rain pouring down in sheets, making visibility nearly impossible. He noticed the way the car swerved, its tires skimming over the wet asphalt, struggling for control. Something was wrong. The boy's instincts screamed at him that the car was headed for trouble. His heart skipped a beat as the car careened towards the guardrail and slammed into it with a deafening crash. The force of the impact sent a shudder through the air, and the boy's body moved before his mind could catch up. Without hesitation, he dashed towards the wreck, determined to help, knowing he couldn't just stand by. As he neared the wreckage, smoke began to billow from the car, the once pristine vehicle now a mangled mess of metal. The boy's heart pounded in his chest as he saw the banker, an arrogant man who had always treated him like he was nothing, lying unconscious behind the wheel. The boy's eyes flicked quickly to the crowd of onlookers gathering around, some of them frozen in place, others already pulling out their phones to record. For a moment, the boy felt a rush of anger, knowing that these people would probably film his every move, but not offer any help. But the anger was quickly pushed aside by a stronger emotion, determination. Despite the rain drenching him and the chaos swirling around him, the boy focused on what mattered. The banker, who had once looked down on him, was now in desperate need of help. The boy didn't pause to think about the years of racial prejudice he had faced, or how this man had belittled him. There was no time for that. This was a life-or-death moment, and he wasn't going to let hatred or bitterness stand in the way of doing what was right. He rushed to the driver's side, his small hands working frantically to pull the injured banker from the wreckage. The boy didn't care about the discomfort of the wet conditions or the risk of getting hurt. His focus was solely on getting the banker to safety. He reached through the window, grasping the banker's arm and pulling with all the strength his small frame could muster. The banker was heavier than he expected, but he wasn't about to stop. The boy's adrenaline surged, and he pulled harder, finally dragging the unconscious man from the car. The smoke thickened, and the sound of the rain pounding against the wreckage filled the air. With the banker in tow, the boy fought against the wet, slippery ground, dragging him away from the wreck. His muscles screamed from the effort, but he didn't slow down. He could hear the muffled voices of the crowd, some calling for help, others still too stunned to move. The boy's focus remained on getting the banker far enough away from the car in case it exploded. His hands were shaking, but he refused to stop. The banker's life depended on him. By the time they were a safe distance from the car, the boy collapsed onto the wet pavement, breathing heavily. His heart was racing, but he felt a sense of relief wash over him, as the banker's shallow breathing confirmed he was still alive. The boy didn't look at the crowd, didn't look for any praise. He simply knelt beside the banker, waiting for help to arrive. He didn't care if anyone noticed his bravery. He wasn't doing this for recognition. He had done it because it was the right thing to do, even for someone who had always treated him like less than human. As emergency responders arrived, the boy stood back, allowing the professionals to take over. The crowd murmured in surprise, some acknowledging his bravery, others still shocked by the turn of events. The boy knew that in the eyes of many, he would always be seen as just a kid from the wrong side of the tracks. But tonight, he had proved that courage didn't come from a title or a status. It came from within, from doing what's right, no matter who was watching or how they had treated you. The banker slowly regained consciousness, feeling a sharp pain in his head as the world around him came back into focus. The cold, damp air and the wet sensation on his clothes made him realize he was lying on the pavement. His first instinct was to sit up, but he stopped as he noticed the 10-year-old boy standing in front of him, his small frame still wet from the rain. The boy looked at him calmly, not asking for anything in return for saving his life. The boy, exhausted but steady, had just pulled him from the wreckage of the car, his quick thinking possibly saving the banker's life. For the first time, the banker looked at the boy not through a lens of prejudice, but as the hero who had just saved him. His heart sank as he realized how wrong he had been, judging the boy solely by his skin color and background. As the crowd around them murmured in shock and disbelief, the banker's guilt grew. This boy, whom he had disregarded and looked down upon for so long, had done what no one else had. He had acted without hesitation. The boy didn't care about their past differences or the way the banker had treated him. He only cared about doing what was right in that moment. The banker's assumptions were shattered in the face of real courage. News of the incident spread quickly, and soon it was all anyone could talk about. The boy's actions went viral, and within hours, people were praising his bravery. Many were shocked that a 10-year-old could act with such selflessness. But the most surprising reaction came from the banker himself. As he thought about the boy's courage and the gravity of his situation, he realized that his behavior toward the boy had been driven by ignorance and bias, and that this boy was far more than what he had ever assumed. Then came the twist. The boy's family, as it turned out, was well connected within the community. Not only had they been involved in local charity work, but they also played an integral part in various business ventures that supported underprivileged communities. The boy wasn't just any child. He was a part of a well-respected and influential family. This revelation stunned the banker even more. He had just been saved by someone who was not only far more capable and accomplished than he had imagined, but was also connected to a larger movement for equality and change in their city. The banker's initial shock slowly turned to regret. He realized that the very person he had treated with disdain had saved his life, and that his past behavior could never be excused. He felt humiliated by the way he had judged the boy, but at the same time, He knew this was a turning point for him. He had seen the error of his ways, and it was time to do something about it. In the days that followed, the banker made a public apology. He admitted his past mistakes, acknowledging that his behavior toward the boy was wrong and rooted in prejudice. His apology wasn't just for the boy, but for everyone he had ever wronged with his biased attitudes. The banker vowed to change, not only as an individual but also within his professional sphere. He promised to work toward creating a more inclusive environment and to start listening to people from all walks of life with respect. The boy's bravery didn't just save a life that night, it sparked a transformation in the banker's heart. The community began to see the true power of kindness, and the boy became a symbol of change and hope. His actions spoke louder than words ever could, proving that even in the face of hatred, love and compassion can shine through. The boy's life and the banker's would never be the same again. Both had been forever changed by the same moment, the boy's act of bravery, which became a catalyst for growth, understanding, and, ultimately, redemption. The banker's public apology marked the beginning of a new chapter, not just for him, but for the entire community. With the weight of his previous prejudices weighing heavily on his conscience, he stood before a crowd of reporters, local leaders, and the community to admit his wrongs. "I've wronged this young man," the banker said, his voice filled with sincerity. "I treated him with disdain, and I have no excuse for that. But what I learned that night is that true respect doesn't come from power or wealth, but from seeing people for who they truly are." His apology didn't stop with just words. The banker recognized the gravity of his actions, and in front of the crowd, he promised to work actively toward changing the way he viewed people, especially those from marginalized communities. The boy, who had been at the center of this transformation, stood quietly by his side, knowing that his actions had not only saved a life, but had sparked a conversation that could lead to real, lasting change. As the news spread about the banker's public acknowledgement of his racism and his subsequent commitment to change, the community began to come together. People who had once remained silent about racial inequality started speaking out. They realized that systemic racism had deep roots in their everyday lives, and it was time to address it head-on. The boys' selflessness had illuminated the flaws in the way they viewed one another, and now they were ready to work together for progress. The banker, realizing his newfound responsibility, pledged a portion of his wealth to support underprivileged communities. He became involved in various initiatives that provided opportunities for marginalized youth, especially in areas that lacked quality education and resources. By directly investing in these communities, he hoped to create a ripple effect of change that would give these young people a chance to succeed, just as the boy had defied expectations and proved that resilience and kindness can break barriers. Meanwhile, the boy's actions didn't just go unnoticed. They became a symbol of hope and resilience. His courage in the face of adversity gained him support from local leaders, who now saw him for what he truly was, a young leader in the making. Educational scholarships and mentorship opportunities were offered to him, and the boy, once dismissed as just another kid from a disadvantaged neighborhood, now had the chance to pursue his dreams of higher education and make a real impact on his community. The community's transformation was gradual but undeniable. Discussions about race, equality, and opportunity became more frequent. Local organizations collaborated with the banker to create initiatives that would directly impact the lives of marginalized groups. The shift in attitudes, sparked by the boy's actions, proved that change is possible when individuals, regardless of their backgrounds, come together with a shared commitment to progress. The boy's story of bravery continued to inspire others, and he used his newfound opportunities to give back. He spoke at schools, community centers, and local events, sharing his experiences and encouraging others to stand up for what's right, no matter the challenges they faced. His message was clear. One act of courage can change the trajectory of not only one person's life, but an entire community's future. As the boy moved forward with his education, his resolve never wavered. He remained focused on his goal to make a difference and to prove that race, background, or circumstances should never define someone's worth. The banker's transformation and his commitment to supporting underprivileged youth were a testament to the power of redemption and growth. This was just the beginning. The boy's bravery had set off a chain reaction that was changing lives, one person at a time. Through his courage, both the banker and the community had been forever altered. And with each passing day, they moved closer to a future where equality, justice, and opportunity were no longer just ideals, but realities. Under the quiet influence of the boy's bravery, the community began to heal. People who once viewed one another with suspicion or disdain now found common ground. Conversations about race, equality, and the future became more frequent, and slowly, but surely, the neighborhood began to change for the better. The banker, who had spent years steeped in his prejudices, found himself questioning everything he once believed. His regret grew with each passing day, and he began the hard work of unraveling the biases he had nurtured over a lifetime. The boy's courage was the catalyst for this transformation. Through his simple yet profound act of selflessness, he had opened a door to a new understanding, not only for the banker, but for the entire community. The once disdainful banker, now humbled by the realization of his wrongs, set out to make amends. He worked hard to create a more inclusive environment, using his wealth and influence to sponsor programs that supported marginalized communities. His role as a wealthy banker had given him the power to influence change, and he used that position to advocate for equality, education, and opportunity. Meanwhile, the boy, though still young, became a beacon of hope for others. His bravery had sparked a ripple effect that no one could have predicted, and his actions inspired other young people to take a stand for what is right. The boy's family, once just another family struggling to get by, was now surrounded by support and admiration from their community. Neighbors who had once overlooked them now respected them, and the boy was seen not just as a student, but as a leader,